Welcome to Neo Academia, where you'll hear real conversations with trailblazing thinkers outside the ivory tower. I'm your host, Natasha Mott, and today I had the pleasure of hanging out with Geoffrey West. We talked science, misinformation, laws of scale, Casablanca, and let me tell you, we had a blast. Geoffrey is a theoretical physicist, but don't hold it against him. He questions universal laws of scale, which is also the title of his book. And he relates these laws to our everyday life, which is no small feat for someone studying elementary particles. In his spare time, he happened to serve as the president of the Sante Fe Institute, and he founded some high-energy physics group at Los Alamos. I don't think I've ever felt so at ease with someone so brilliant, and I talk to a lot of smart people. So I hope you enjoy this conversation because I sure did. And as always, I'm so grateful that you're here to enjoy these conversations with me, so please do engage, like, subscribe, comment, share, all that stuff. I also couldn't do this without support from Big Nerve. You know, that idea tournament game for innovative thinkers that I keep talking about? I've been working with Big Nerve for a while now to develop a community of innovative, creative thinkers, and their goal is simple. They want to recognize and fund creative thinkers. They're trying to create an entire new profession of innovation where catalysts like me could ask interesting and engaging questions, and innovators like you can answer them. There are many different ways to play. You can ask questions, answer them, rate answers, mentor answers. All of this earns you points. At the end of the month, these idea tournaments pay out to the top 30 participants, and everybody gains some more experience points and gets known for their expertise. This game is meant to elevate creative thinkers and their ideas. To join my team, you'll have to click on the Big Nerve question in the Theory Gang newsletter, where each episode I'll design a special question relevant to the guest and discussion. All right, here's the episode. Now don't forget to listen all the way to the end for the question. So none of us are having any crises at the moment, so that's good. Because
So, by the way, I apologize for last week. Well, especially it was sort of last minute. So thanks for adapting to that.
No, you adapted as well. And this is something that I think is a good place to start, because what I observed about you now, meeting you, and everybody has this kind of parasocial relationship with people that have an online presence, but meeting you is fully consistent with what I've seen from your online presence. You just have this relaxed persona, I think, and it's fun and lighthearted, and I feel like a lot of people you meet aren't necessarily like that in this intellectual space. Like, would you agree?
Yes, I do agree, and I guess it does. There's a piece of me that was very much influenced, I think, early in my sort of teenage years by the theater of the absurd, which I don't know if that means anything to you, but anyway. But and also, sort of 50s, 60s British humor that developed into Monty Python. So there's a piece of me that sort of doesn't take everything so seriously. And, even though, I mean, that I'm kind of schizophrenic because, yes, on the other hand, I'm deadly serious and passionate about my work and what I do and so on. But I
Right.
sort of recognize that there's also this kind of cosmic joke kind of background to everything.
Yes, it's the Kafkan kind of nightmare, Like, I mean,
Yeah.
you can't get out of this alive. It's,
Sure.
But I think you're absolutely right. Like, I was so surprised to hear you say that, but not really, because I think everybody that I gravitate towards has like this tiny absurdist flair to them,
Yeah.
because like you said, while what we're doing in science is incredibly serious and mechanized and rational, we also are in human bodies with human brains doing this.
Mhm.
And I think people think that we have to like abandon our human bodies and our eccentricities and idiosyncrasies to be able to do science. And it's just, not only is it not possible, it's just silly to even try to do that.
Yeah. Sure.
So how do you think things have changed over time at the Sante Fe Institute, like from your perspective?
Well, yeah, that's sort of a tough question to answer, especially because I'm part of it. So, and it's hard to get distance when you're part of something, really, and to be well, by definition, it's impossible to be objective. But on the one hand, I would say, in terms of the conventional metrics of science or the conventional standards, I would say the science and the rigor of it has got better, has improved, no question. Not that it was bad, simply that it's got much more so. On the other hand, that's at the cost of being a little less maverick. And we are there because we're slightly, even though we're integral to the academic system and the network, we're also a little bit outside it, and it was set up precisely that way to do something that's complementary to the canonical way in which we, all universities effectively, and essentially all institutes are set up. I mean, universities, of course, divided into departments, and departments are divided into what have now become semi-autonomous sub-departments that don't speak to each other anyway, and so on. And institutes are highly focused, generally, with one or two notable exceptions. But none has been set up to do what the SFI was supposed to do, and to set up to do something that crosses all the various boundaries of the disciplines, and to bring people together and just to think in terms of what are the big questions, and getting people from different perspectives, different techniques, different abilities and so on to come together to try to deal with some of these questions, answer some of these questions, or even pose some of the questions. And ironically, I mean, it was quite radical when it was founded. And the great irony about that is that it was founded by people that were the center and the core of the conventional academia. I mean, which is very unusual, that they had the foresight to see that there was what I consider still a kind of, they didn't use these terms, I think, a sort of slowly developing impending crisis, that more and more we are getting highly focused on very detailed individual things, all of which is very important. I mean, that is sort of 90% of what we should be doing, but at the expense of not answering some of the bigger questions and some of the bigger issues, and thinking in bigger terms. And in fact, the whole reward system, and that what was remarkable, the reward system, meaning everything from the obvious things of grants and tenure and so on, but even the respect of your peers is geared towards doing some very specific detailed thing. And, this group of people who were highly successful and obviously could get as much funding and accolades as they sort of wanted, decided that, we needed to have another place on the landscape that was somewhat complementary to that, and in some ways in tension with it. And that's what the Sante Fe Institute is. And so it attracted at the beginning some people that by definition were sort of mavericks, and even though they were successful of themselves, were sort of wanted to be a little bit outside of the framework.
Like you?
Well, I came later, and I'm eternally grateful for the existence of the Institute, that I found, a place that I hadn't quite realized, and I think other people have felt this too. Actually, I was searching for much of my career. As much as I enjoyed a career that was in a very focused part of science, namely high energy physics. So it attracted people like that. And I would say we have less of that now. It's not the quality. I won't argue about the quality, but less so, a little bit less so. And one of the things that reflects is the trend in academia more and more away from tolerating people that want to be a little bit on the outside or want to do something a little bit different. The system doesn't reward it. And the great irony, again, of all of that is that the great success in some ways of the Sante Fe Institute is that not that it's become an acceptable place, an almost, prestigious place in some respects, but that the things it stood for, everything from promoting the idea of complexity science or complex adaptive systems as something not only worthy of study, but centrally important for 21st century questions, but also really promoting serious transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, whatever kinds of interactions and collaborations. So much so that every university, every president of every major university says, that's what we want to be doing. This is what we're... And the great irony is, the more they say that, the less it happens within their universities. This is what's so incredible. And I always say it's a bit like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The more you say it, on the one hand, the more you say interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, the less it actually happens. I mean, and, that's a sort of cartoon version, but that's my perception. That's my anecdotal perception of what's been happening. And, maybe that will change, maybe not, I don't know. So that gets reflected in the Sante Fe Institute, and answers your original question, that, we feed off, obviously, the academic community. And if the academic community is sort of just not allowing anybody to sort of seep through beyond a postdoc level of wanting to sort of branch out a bit or cross lines and do something a bit different, ask somewhat, speculative questions. If it's suppressing that already at the postdoc level, there aren't people that we can sort of bring into the network that are going to be central to the Sante Fe Institute. Now, so this is it's a gradual effect, but that's one of the perceptions that I've noticed I've been at the Sante Fe Institute close to 20 years now, which is a long time, but I've been associated with it for closer to 25 to 30 years. And that is the sort of change that has taken place. It's not a huge change, but it is something, and I bring it up because it's a concern, and it's a concern not just for the Sante Fe Institute, but in fact, I consider it a much greater concern for the academic enterprise and the kinds of challenges that we're facing in the 21st century.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's kind of part of the reason why I started this podcast, because I feel like there's such a rigidity to what is happening, and it's rigid in the wrong ways. I think it's headed for demise for a number of reasons that I've discussed many times on this podcast. We could write 10 books about why it's headed for demise. But I think a big part of that is the university doesn't know what it wants to be or what it wants to do. Is it a center for epistemological investigation? Or is it a center for vocational?
Yeah.
What I think we have here is the Sante Fe Institute represents an epistemological challenge to the current paradigm. And I don't know, I haven't read a lot of the philosophy on complexity yet, but it kind of fucks with the whole scientific method a little bit,
Yeah.
What do you have to say to that? Because that's me coming into this, me just learning about the Sante Fe Institute. I'm like, I'm over here reading philosophy of science going, what are we doing here? This is a little like anarchistic.
So that's an interesting question. But ironically, from my perspective, the Sante Fe Institute is one of the most conservative in terms of, because it goes back with a very small c, because it goes back to what science, what many of us were attracted to science for and to academia for, just at a personal level, I didn't think I would become an academic, but my image of an academic was very romantic.
Mine too.
It's a community of scholars discussing some of the big questions and so on. Not that I didn't think you'd also have to do the hard work. In fact, I'm a big proponent of, ironically, of disciplines and being disciplined and working on, very specific problems and doing that, but within the context of big questions and so on, and being in a community where we come together and we exchange views on that and discuss them and speculate and, sort of bullshit in the best sense of that, and really. And, that's what I sort of had this image of, which was probably possibly true in the 19th century. I don't know if it was even true then. But, it probably was true at some stage and probably lasted. In fact, my image, as I was an undergraduate at Cambridge in England, and that was the image most of us had, I think, that we're interested in academics. Most of us had of what was going on at high table, in quotes, among the, they were discussing the big questions. Now, probably they weren't. But in fact, I hate to say I'm very ADD, so I'm going to go off on a tangent. So one of my great amusements and disappointments was when I sort of grew up and I was invited to be at high table with some of the great things. What did they discuss? The shortest route. How do you drive from A to B, from Peterborough to Cambridge, or how do you do this? And what's the, a restaurant, like everybody else. It wasn't, I mean, there were some very stimulating conversations at times, but so I did have a romantic and maybe unrealistic image, and many of us were brought up on that. I mean, I think people still have some of that, but the reality is moved far away from that. And indeed, what you said at the beginning, a few minutes ago, this tension that has always been there, actually, between, on the one hand, the university as doing scholarship and, very much not concerned necessarily what its impact will be on, quote, the real world. That's one extreme. The other extreme being, as you say, almost a vocational school. We're training, training lawyers and doctors and practitioners of various kinds and engineers as it should. But, I think the pendulum has strongly swung, in my lifetime, has strongly swung towards the more practical, professional school training kind of thing. And concomitant with that, universities have become much more corporate. I mean, they always necessarily were corporate, to some extent were corporate. There has to be a business plan and so on,
Sure.
budgets and so forth. So that's inevitable. But they've now become much more like businesses. I mean, for example, it was publish or perish when I sort of entered academic field, and that was already sort of new. That was the new sort of buzzword, publish or perish. Now it's publish, perish, and most importantly, bring in the money. And that's almost, I mean, I know many cases where that's absolutely explicit. And one of the more bizarre phenomena is in many universities, many departments, the amount of space you're allocated is dependent upon how much money you bring in.
Yep.
And
Which makes zero sense, by the way. I mean, as you know, in physics, I mean, what are they doing at CERN? Where is all the money for all the space they're taking up over there? They need to be making more money with that big old thing.
So that's the thing. So CERN is a fantastic example of the counter to that, of course, in a way. Here it is doing this useless work, quote in quotes, discovering Higgs bosons and all the rest of the stuff that I still am fascinated by and passionate about. Don't work in it anymore. But, it's fantastic, and it speaks well, despite all the forces working in the opposite direction over the last 50 to 75 years, that it is still maintained and it is still doing primarily science for science sake kind of thing. And people respect that because there still is an interest in, what are the fundamental particles and fundamental laws, and then it's complemented with, LIGO and the discovery of gravitational waves and the origins of the universe and all these marvelous questions. And that's great. But, in universities, that's getting squeezed out more and more. And more to the point, what's getting squeezed out more and more are the humanities. I mean, when I was a student, English and the classics and even modern languages were majors that many undergraduates were in. It was a huge part of the university. And now they're sort of sidelined. And, again, I think a warning sign. And again, reflects much of what's happened in the culture.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we have now is like this. There's this book I'm reading like eternally. I read a little bit here and there, but it's Making of Middlebrow Culture, and kind of talking about how academics have this ire against people trying to kind of translate their work. But I feel like we've gone so far to translate things that we've stopped producing the things maybe that need translating. Everything's going to be translated, and then we're going to go, okay, now what are we translating? I read live on TikTok every day. I read Thomas Kuhn and Popper and stuff like that. And I'm translating, in situ, kind of like reading a passage and then translating it. And I think it's funny. I think it's entertaining and it's enjoyable because it's bringing stuff to them. But then I thought, maybe I should really be creating my own philosophy instead of translating the works of others.
Do both, maybe. Yes. No, but I will say one of the positive things that's happened is translation might be I don't know if that's the right word, but certainly trying to bring some of the ideas and concepts of science and the achievements of science to the general public. And that has improved enormously in the last 50 years. But it's also had the downside that it's sort of published in the New York Times kind of, it's hyped everything up. And it's sort of debasing the currency somehow. And I feel a bit nervous about that. I wrote my book partially to, as an outreach kind of thing, but also because I was interested in bringing together a lot of things I've been thinking about. But I made a commitment to myself that in writing this book, I would try two things I would try to do, which I wasn't sure I could do. One was I would make it amenable to sort of the intelligent layperson. Actually, I said at the beginning, to my mother, who's dead, by the way, been dead a long time, been dead. And my mother, by the way, left school at 13 and can barely read or write. But I felt, what did her son actually do with all that?
Like,
now, let me see if I can
what do you do? What do you do all day?
Explain that to my mother. I mean, it was, but that was sort of the idea to the kind of intelligent layperson. That means ultimately there would be no equations in it, and that's the language I use. But I would explain sort of everything. I wouldn't dangle everything, and I wouldn't sort of pull things out of the hat. I wouldn't be a Malcolm Gladwell and so on. Gee whiz, fantastic. I mean, that's what the publishers wanted, in fact. But I felt I couldn't do that. I mean, I don't mean to badmouth Malcolm Gladwell. Quite the contrary. I think he's
his own thing.
He's his own thing, and he does it brilliantly. I mean, it's not my thing, that's for sure. Or my friend Nassim Taleb, who also is a sort of similar kind of thing. But they serve a very important role, there's no question. But I wanted to stay sort of true to the science. So everything that came up, I wanted to try to explain in English. And
I think you did.
And I worked very hard at that. So in that sense, I'm very pleased because it did sell well. It did well, maybe not as well as the publishers wanted, because I made it, I made it much longer because I wanted to explain everything. But there's no question that the trend overwhelmingly is to move in that sort of gee whiz, quick, tweety kind of mode. And that does serve a purpose, and I'm okay with that. But we also need substance. And of course, it's a real problem because and I'm a bit of a platitude here, but the educational system has, of course, totally let us down, because I shouldn't need to have to explain in that book that I wrote, spent 3 or 4 pages explaining what an exponential is. It's in the language. People use it all the time. But what I learnt in my talks outside of academia, to corporate events and other kinds of fancy schmancy kinds of things, that amazingly, people actually didn't really understand what an exponential was and what it implied. And that was a bit scary because if you don't understand what an exponential is, you'll never get that we're in deep doo-doo. Put it in simple
Let me
terms.
say this. I think this is a misconception, I think, amongst people who try to write for lay audience. Being deeply integrated with a lay audience, I realize there's specific types of people. In a corporate setting, they're not concerned with exponentials. Why? Because their day to day is
Yeah, of course,
incremental.
absolutely.
But what I will say, there are certain people who are obsessed with exponentials,
Yes.
lay people, right? So, for example, and don't hate me for this, but your example of Godzilla you gave in the book, why Godzilla is like physiologically
Yeah.
impossible. I took a picture of Godzilla as a green screen and put it as my background on TikTok and said, Geoffrey West says Godzilla is physiologically impossible. And it's this kind of debate bro scenario online where people will come and be like, that's not true. And people loved it. They went crazy. And
Oh.
I had people come up and they went through, they're like, oh yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think he's wrong about how much Godzilla, should weigh. They had so much. I was blown away
That is
by
very interesting. I didn't know that. This is very interesting.
they and so I had people coming up on like to tell me specific things and like to correct you and like say, actually, if you thought about all these other things, so suffice it to say that people aren't dumb.
No,
They're just
absolutely.
selectively interested.
Sure.
Like this guy is obsessed. He's like, check out this YouTube video, read this. He's obsessed with reptiles, fossils, Godzilla, all potential,
Yeah.
we were like, does Godzilla have a cloaca? I mean, it was hilarious.
That is great.
It-
I mean, mine was sort of just, I mean, it wasn't to be taken seriously. There was a point to be made, and that was
right.
that, that if Godzilla is made of the same stuff that we're all made of, meaning the biosphere is made of, it simply can't exist. One of the things I don't think I said in the book, I've often said in lectures sometimes, I said, you asked yourself about birds and flight. Well, evolution overcame that and developed wings and the kind of musculature and physiology and metabolism so that birds can fly. And then you could ask, how big a bird could you have that can still fly? And it's not very big. But of course, that's the whole point. If it's made of the same stuff as us, with the same kind of physiology and so forth, there's a very sort of strict limit to how big a bird can be. However, evolution has got round it because now we have birds that are humongous and we call them
Right.
airplanes.
Right.
I mean, and how did evolution do it? It evolved us and our brains, who then
Mm-hmm.
figured out how to get round it by going outside of the biosphere, using different materials and so on that have greater strength and a different mode of flight. And that would be true of Godzilla. It's not that an object like that couldn't, in principle, exist if you made it out of, titanium and what else? I don't know what else you'd have to do. But I'm not an engineer. But I'm sure a smart engineer could, in principle, design something like Godzilla, a kind of science fiction-y thing that would be all mechanical. And of course, the whole development of robots and all the rest is just a science fiction version of that. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not, I'm frankly, I mean, it's sort of interesting for me. I'm less interested in that. It's sort of interesting. I'm not a science fiction-y kind of person because I find science fact to be so extraordinary and so amazing. And it is so much harder than science fiction because you have these constraints of these laws. You can't sort of do anything, you can't sort of make things up out of the blue.
Right. Well,
Like
I
you
mean,
can't say there's a Godzilla. There can't be a land animal that is a mammal like us. We could not evolve to be something the size of Godzilla. Now, that's sort of interesting of itself. And in fact, in terms of mammals, you can't get something even as big as the biggest dinosaurs.
right. I mean, I think all of this is a jumping off point for curiosity. And I think this is what we're missing weirdly in academia now. And it's weird that we have to be outside of it for this. Because I think for a period of time, if you were a curious person, you were going to end up, in physics or science or something. I mean, philosophy, who knows?
Mhm.
But all this Godzilla talk, what this showed me is that people are innately curious
Yeah.
about things that they want to think about. But if you put them in a university setting, one guy was like, I think I'm going to get a PhD in paleontology. I was like, oh gosh, good luck. Because you don't really this isn't what you're going to get to do. You're going to do other stuff. So for people who are innately curious, going inside the academic assembly line, I feel like it kills it. And I'm wondering, I think this is kind of a universal law. There's some like conciliant laws that I'm observing, like bundling and unbundling. Like as we bundled all these things into the university, certain things are starting to unbundle from it, like curiosity, for example. Where is that going? And what's going to happen to curiosity and people who like to think like that on the outside of the university? Where are they going to rebundle? So that's, just something that I'm kind of, what do you think?
Well, no, I agree with you that the way it is, I mean, most people who end up, first of all, going to college and then deciding they'd like to go to graduate school and they get interested in research, whatever it is, could be in the humanities, but if in the sciences and so on, are usually extremely curious and want to understand something. And now a certain number go in, and maybe even the majority go in because this is a route to getting a better job, a career path, and so on. And that's fine. I think that's, part of what a university is for. But, there's now a minority that are very curious and have this kind of boyish, girlish curiosity from young age. How do things work? Why are we here? And so on. And the academic system, except in few cases, eventually beats it out of you because, it needn't. And part of it is because the pressures now are so intense. The pressures to get this piece of work done, to get the funding for it, to maintain the funding, to get it published in a high-profile journal, and to get positive feedback from your peers, to get a reward from whatever the professional society or from your department or university. These are enormous pressures. So the professors are under great pressure, typically, and that gets translated down often to students. And I think it's just so much greater than it ever was, so that time for ruminating or to take out 3 months to think about something, put your work aside and start either thinking about some interesting issue that's turned up that you'd like to explore tangentially, or take off for summer and start writing your great novel, even though you're working on, genetics, I don't know, whatever. Those days are long past. I mean, I think people could do that once upon a time. And, we can't do that. And time, one of the things that astonished me about my own work was to discover that my work led me, sort of the conceptual development and the equations that follow from it, led me to realize that built into the very nature of our interactions is this speeding up of time, this accelerating pace of life. And more did I become to speculate that a major origin of much of the problems we face in society it can be put in terms of the accelerating pace of life. And there isn't time. There's getting less and less time to just speculate and start thinking about other things and just even take time off. One of the things that is so amazing is how few academics take vacations, including me. The idea that you would take a month off and go to a villa in Tuscany and say, fuck my work for a month. I don't know anybody that does that. I used to know people people in academia used to do that, used to go, but people don't do
It's
it
a
anymore.
vice now.
They feel they can't afford to do it.
Yeah.
And in fact, one of the things, it's
the
amazing.
social pressure is like,
yeah, the
wow.
pressure even, and of course what happens is you get conditioned to that.
Yeah.
And I can feel it myself. I can confess, I'm 82 years old and I don't have to do anything and most of the reason I work is because I enjoy doing it and things I want to get done. But I'm always amazed. There's a piece of me sometimes in the evening when I want to watch a video, I suddenly feel guilty.
Oh no.
I should be working. Now that's
Oh
changed a
my God.
lot recently in the last couple of years, especially since COVID. But
Yeah.
I had that, and I think I'm not atypical, probably. Many times I overcame it, but other times I would
Yeah.
say, no, that's right, I should go back and do. Because most of my career, I have to say that when I stayed up, and I used to do that, as many theoretical physicists do, you stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning trying to find the bloody minus sign or the pi or whatever it is that's
Yeah.
missing. You can't, where now what happened here?
My husband calls this chain smoking. He's like, you take years off your life when you do this.
Yeah, but it's great. It's a fantastic experience, actually. And I do that. I can't do that anymore. It's just, I don't have the sort of stamina and energy to do it. But it is interesting, going back to what I said earlier, that you make this kind of Faustian bargain unconsciously that I'll join in the system and do all this stuff, jump through all the hoops and all those, because then when I get tenure and I have time, then I'm going to go and write my great novel or do my great opus, and I'm going to change science. And this great idea of anti-gravity, I'm going to, something, you never do it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was very lucky because by accident, I ended up being able to do that. No, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, and I feel extremely
There might be
fortunate.
some irony in there. I mean, there's, it's a little woo woo, but there might be some irony in there that when you're charging full steam with full intensity, it doesn't happen for you. Like I was thinking about how this pressure makes people assholes and experiencing this in the context of medicine. So I left biomedical science and went into biotech. And it was my job to meet some of the world's expert oncologists or cardiologists or whoever. And it was my job to develop relationships with them and hear their best ideas and kind of, shoot the shit. And what I found is there's this like band of people who are not the best. They're like second tier and they're absolute shitheads.
Hmm.
And I'm like, I feel like it's the pressure that's cooked them. Whereas the people who are flying high, they are the nicest people and they make it look easy. And the rest of these people are so angry because they spin their wheels.
Mm.
Is it just me or might there be some
Well,
generality to
I
this?
don't know. Since I've been at the Sante Fe Institute for the last 20 years, I'm sort of out of the loop on some of that, to be honest. I mean, we're a bit, there is a piece of the Sante Fe Institute that's a bit ivory towerish after all, and which is good and bad. And so I'm less, I mean, many years ago, I was one of the people that I think I was not unique, introduced the term revenge of the sea students,
Yes, I love it.
which is very unfair and very cruel. But it was that often the people that end up in supervisory, administrative, and positions of power to make decisions are people that didn't make it. It's a bit like, was it George Bernard Shaw made, those that can do, those that can't teach, which is also a very cruel statement. But, we understand it's not true what he says, of course, in general. But like my statement, the revenge of the sea students or others, there's a piece of truth to that.
Sure.
And it gets reflected in bad behavior by either you have poor teachers, poor educators, and some whom end up frustrated and angry and take it out on their students, whether they're, kindergarten or whether they're in, graduate school. And the administrators who get in positions of power, who may have resentment of not having success and so on, can behave like assholes, there's no question. Or editors, or reviewers. So that happens. I hope it's a minority of people, but I've certainly, it's totally anecdotal, my experience, and but I've certainly been aware of it, and
Well, I mean, this is something I'm interested like across disciplines. Like I think that the band of assholes exists in
Yeah.
every discipline, I think.
I
It's
have
just
speculated, by the way, and I'm certainly not the first to do so, that the people ending up in our governments, I mean, in our Congress, are many of these kinds of people.
mm,
And I would say, and here I may get into big trouble, but I think the kinds of anger and revengeful behavior of people, especially on the right in the Republican Party, almost reflects that. The resentment against expertise and against science and against academia that exists in at least a minority is somehow a reflection of this. It's very deleterious, and I
mm,
regretful because it's bad for all of us. It's bad for them
right.
too. I think I mean, just let me say, my impression of politicians and indeed of administrators overall, personal experience, has primarily been quite positive in the sense that the ones I meet are extremely well-meaning. Many
Mm,
do, in a certain sense, maybe this is too strong, are kind of almost self-sacrificing, and they
mm,
want to do good. They want to be facilitators. They want sort of the best science. They want the best use of the dollars and so on. It sometimes get a little bit twisted and so on. But I think most people, I mean, it's a bit like what you said. I just realized I'm just sort of brainstorming here. You do learn, despite everything, that most people are quite smart.
mm,
I mean, they really are. And I have great respect for that. And in the same way that I've learned that most people in administrative positions of various kinds, or even those in extremely powerful positions whom I've met, both in politics and in corporate life, actually are very well-meaning. It may be that actions speak louder than words, so maybe walls put over my eyes, but I've always been quite impressed, I must say, how they want to do good, but, it's the
yeah.
problem that it
The
may
road to
be.
hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I mean, I've often thought, I don't know Mark Zuckerberg, but the poor guy has been so, trashed, and he says some stupid things, in my opinion, or Elon Musk, I mean,
Hmm.
but, and I have met Elon Musk, actually, and I've talked with him, but, these are not evil people. They're
Right.
not purposely trying to fuck everybody over. I mean,
Right.
it may be that they want more money and more power. Okay,
Maybe.
but, so maybe did Martin Luther King, actually.
Mm,
you
hmm.
know.
Yeah.
So I try to be slow to judgment, and I think
Yeah.
that's a
That's good.
good rule in life.
Yeah, I think the problem that I see, the one that you're kind of outlining here with the resentment towards expertise and the well-meaning experts or what even, I mean, you said well-meaning admins, but I even think some well-meaning experts
Yes,
is hubris.
yes,
There's a
yeah.
problem here all the way around. And I noticed this at the Collective Intelligence
Oh
Symposium.
yeah,
We kind of tiptoed around G, and I was sitting and hanging out with Maxim, one of the speakers, Maxim, for a while, and I was like, if you don't go up there on that panel and mention general intelligence, I'm gonna flip a gasket. And so they started talking about it. But we tiptoe around these things because we're afraid of them.
yeah,
And I think the problem is, like, if you think about the experts or people who are more knowledgeable or educated, they probably do have a high general intelligence, and therefore they think they can extrapolate
yes,
their experience and expertise and all this stuff to everything else. And then the people who are ignorant see all this experience and all this expertise just flying out for free. They're like, I could grab some of that. So either way, it's hubris on both
yes,
sides and a refusal to kind of meet in the middle and say, I don't know everything, and you're capable of learning if you want to, but I know what I'm talking about this specific thing,
exactly.
like with 90%
Yes.
confidence. What we're not having those
I
conversations.
feel very, yes, I resonate very strongly with what you said. That, well, first of all, there tends to be, especially these days more and more, a cultivation of arrogance and narcissism. And that gets in the way of many things I just said, actually. I mean, and that perverts much of what people try to do and want to do, even though they may believe and may even be quite well-meaning. But that's kind of self-deception of, importance and arrogance tends to dominate things. And the thing that you said in particular, I strongly resonate with, the idea that when people get rewarded and get put on a pedestal for something, there is a propensity for them to then think that, oh, yeah, actually, I can make statements about global warming or about the economy or about racial relations or inequality, even though I've never done any work in it, but I have an opinion. So why not? And I see that, I hope I don't get in trouble for this one either, is that I've known quite a lot of Nobel Prize winners in my career, and some have been good friends of mine, and they're obviously extremely smart people. But, the truth is that some of them are in the right place, the right time, and they do it. And that's fine. That's good. That's the way life is. And more to them that even though they may not even realized it, they took advantage of it. And so that deserves credit and reward. So then they become Nobel Prize winner, and some are quite modest about it and recognize that. But, once you become a Nobel Prize winner, for example, you then get invited to all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the work that you did whatsoever. And not only that, you're paid some humongous fee to pay for it, and you get all these invitations, and people treat you as a VIP, put you on a pedestal. So within 2 to 3 years, you become an expert in everything, and you pontificate about everything, and you get invited to things that you know nothing about, and you give a talk on it. So, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but I've seen it firsthand many times. And I realize, and it's sad, and you do see that. And it's not that they're being malicious in any way, but they're being human, actually. I mean, because I may decry it, and I have been quite sarcastic about it, but I'd probably be exactly the same.
Yeah, I do it too.
Once your ego, it's very hard to control that. And you get this feedback and you're told how brilliant you are.
I'm sure Daniel Kahneman would have something to say about this, I'm sure.
So, and it's unusual. And I've known some that don't do that, by the way. This is not a general, it's just some. And it probably is a minority, actually, but enough to make it bothersome and annoying. And it's part of being human, and it's the unusual that can resist that and say, well, it'd be nice to get up and say, well, I was invited here to talk about, climate change and so on, but, I have no expertise in it whatsoever. And my opinion is not worth much more than yours. I'm happy to spend 20 minutes and tell you what mine is as part of the discussion. But, others, you should really listen to the experts. You should
the problem is that's probably the person you should listen to. The person says, I don't know shit about this.
So anyway, no, it's sort of interesting. But on the other hand, that can be important to have someone coming from the outside that's obviously smart and give some. So again, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. But I do agree that one of the things that has become a huge issue across the entire spectrum is this cultivation of narcissism and putting yourself.
We don't have a beginner's mindset. And I think this has something to do with the ambition in our society. And, we talked about kind of the treadmill, the academic treadmill, but it's also a corporate treadmill. There's all these kinds of false meritocracies that we slingshot ourselves upon. And what happens is once you, like you said, you get that success, whether it's Nobel Prize, you move up to a VP position, you get promoted, whatever it is, you then resist the beginner's mindset for whatever you endeavor towards next, because you're like, well, I'm already kick ass at this thing. I'm not a beginner. And it's this like false sense of security that you have some crystallized knowledge that can't be taken away and that shouldn't be taken away. And I think one of the things I think needs to happen with respect to education is we need like educational sabbaticals for people. where every 5 to 10 years, you're like, you know what? I really want to take some time and study this thing, whatever it is, for the sake of studying it. And then you're forced into being a beginner again.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how we would facilitate this. I don't know. Maybe we won't have jobs in 10 years, but,
Maybe.
doubtful. The people who work hard will definitely keep jobs. I mean, that's going to happen. But I worry about the future of education. But at the same time, I think the curious people, you can't stop.
No,
They're
of
going to
course.
be curious.
Sure.
They're going to find. So I'm more interested and curious myself to watch it play out. But I do tend to worry about the people who could be curious. You need to stoke the fire a little bit for them. And I think we're missing opportunities with that. So one of the things I want to talk to you about is your kids.
Our kids?
Yeah, your kids.
Oh, wow.
You stoking the fire with your kids. Your son's a professor, right?
Yes.
And your daughter's is she at Google or Stanford?
No. So let's see. Okay. So I have two children. One is, as you say, is a professor at USC, University of Southern California, in earth sciences. And as we speak, he's somewhere completely remote in the middle of nowhere in the Amazon in Peru.
Lovely.
Doing whatever he does.
Awesome.
He's one of his many interests is the whole question of water and long-term sustainability and all those kinds of questions and so on. So anyway, he's an earth scientist, and he was, by the way, an Olympic silver medalist.
Wow.
In rowing. Yeah, he's a big guy and he's very strong and he's very dedicated and goes at it. He's passionate.
He's a go-getter. Yeah.
Yeah, he's very good. And then I have a daughter who decided early on she didn't want to do anything academic because both her parents and her brother had PhDs, and that's not what she wanted. And she also was a rower. She was an NCAA champ rower at Brown. But she went into political science. And she's very much a do-gooder in the best possible way.
Okay.
But they moved recently to London. That's what they both moved to London. And she now works for something called the Tony Blair Institute, which is an NGO trying to do good around the world. And
so you've had some kind of impact on these kids.
Presumably, you often wonder. You often wonder when do you have children?
I do. Yeah, I have one.
So, it's, of course you have an impact whether you like it or not. And you hope that it's positive. And no, it's great. I'm very, very proud and pleased about my children. They both turned out, and their families have turned out very well.
Well, the reason I ask is because I think, you're an octogenarian, and I think you don't get to have many conversations with an octogenarian of like your stature, right? You've been through a lot, you've done a lot. And kind of, I remember reading, oh gosh, now I'm going to say who it is, but I remember reading Eric Kandel's autobiography. And I was so enamored with Eric Kandel when I was in grad school. Actually, funny story, I actually walked into a sliding glass door when I saw him at a conference, like so stupid. But I read his autobiography after that, and I was so sad. I was just like, wow, because he was in there. He barely talks about his kids, and he was kind of like, I don't think I was that great of a dad.
Oh.
And I think we don't, for women especially in this profession, it often feels like you have to choose between one or the other.
Very good.
And anytime you make constant choices, it's not absolute choices. It's these small choices here and there. But we don't talk about, having a family when you're intensely interested in something. And it seems to have worked out for you,
Well, it's very interesting you bring it. Now I understand why you asked the question. Yes. So I think, anybody that goes, well, it's not just academia, but any career, there's this tension between family on the one hand and your work and your advancement and so on the other. And I always think academia is more so because, at least in my academic career, because part of the culture is you work in the evenings. I mean, I would probably work 80 hours a week, I would say. And that just doesn't go easily with family. But I made a decision early on, once I had family, that was actually I wanted to make it priority. The family was priority. And in fact, for a number of years, I barely gave talks. I didn't go to conferences, or very rarely, so I could be home because my wife, who is a a Jungian psychoanalyst,
Oh, good.
was also had a private practice, and so there was juggling balls and so on. But I think we both were very strongly devoted to the children were central, and family more generally were central. But it's always a balancing act, and it's extremely complicated. So you know, I never took a regular sabbatical my whole career.
Mhm.
So it's a tough issue. I just talked about I can see it with my son. Look, he's in Peru in the Amazon for 4 weeks.
Right.
He has a wife with a 2-year-old, and she's pregnant. I
Yeah.
said to him, haven't social services been in touch with you to haul you away,
Yeah.
abandoning your wife and children? Anyway, no, they figure, they
Yeah.
figured
It's
it out.
difficult
You have
though.
to figure it out. And there's balancing,
Yeah.
there's huge balancing act goes on. And each couple, each family, whatever it is, has to clearly compromise in various ways. But I do think
Yeah.
it's very important. And I remember, it's funny you brought up Eric Kandel, whom I didn't know, but I have a great respect for. I knew people that worked with him. And I saw a couple of interviews of his, which I found very impressive. But there was a book many years ago written by a man named Stan Ulam, which may not mean much to you. Do you know who Ulam was?
Mm-mm.
Oh, Ulam was a great mathematician. He was sort of a one-man Sante Fe Institute back in the 40s and
Mhm.
so on. He's most famous, unfortunately, for he worked with Edward Teller to figure out how the bomb worked, to do actually the
Mhm.
triggering of the bomb. So that
Mhm.
because he was part of the Manhattan Project. But Stan Ulam lived in Santa Fe, stayed in Santa Fe. He decided to stay here, and he's famous for many things. But he wrote a book. There was something called The Life of a Mathematician, short book about his
Mhm.
life. And I remember reading it, and he was talking about, he did this work, and he visited this conference, and he talked with that, and blah, blah. And then it's sort of in the middle. And then I got married. And then I went to this conference, and I went to that conference. And I thought, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Here's, one of the most important events in your life. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh,
Pit stop.
and then I went for a hike up the mountain. And then
Yeah.
it was like, and there was almost nothing. And I knew, by the way, I was good friends with his daughter and family. So I knew that, but I never brought it up to. I meant to at some stage, but I never had the kind of the balls to
Yeah.
so, because he was a very lovely man, by the way. It wasn't like he
Mhm.
was well, as Candell seems to be. I didn't meet him, but he came across as a very warm person, and I knew that.
He has that affect of just kind
Yeah,
of,
so I
and
was
just
very
brimming.
surprised. I was surprised when you told me actually that he felt anyway he didn't spend enough time with his children, and that's very common, of course. I mean, it's not uncommon among scientists to feel that they've not spent
Yeah.
sufficient time. I do. I would not say of all the regrets and the extraordinary guilt I carry with me about my life, this is not one of them, actually.
That's good.
To tell you the
I'm glad
truth.
to hear that.
Yeah, no, I don't
Yeah.
feel that there are various things I did wrong with my children, or I didn't do, or, whatever, but not spending the kinds of time and so-called quality time. I don't feel that. There are various kinds of time I didn't spend with them. I felt that I could have done, but that's a whole different thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this was a pivotal moment for me. I was reading, so we decided we were going to have a baby, and we went on a vacation to kick it off. Kind of, I just gotten a grant, so I was like, "Oh, let's go to Mexico and kick off our baby moon kind of situation." And I took Candel's book with me to read on the beach, and I remember putting it down, and I was just like, "Fuck this!" Like, no. Like
Yeah,
it was a wonderful book, but when I got to the end, I was like, I don't know if I will be that kind of woman who could, like my boss and everybody was like, oh, you have the baby, you come right back to work, it'll be great.
Yeah.
It was not like that for me. My brain, I mean, as we know from the evidence we found, your brain changes during pregnancy.
Yeah. Sure.
And mine certainly did. I wanted to be with my baby. I
Yeah.
wanted to be
Sure.
with my daughter. And the system just, didn't really allow that. And I think that was like the justification for myself to be like, okay, you don't have to do this.
No, it's a tough one, and I think for women, especially more so, because there is, despite
Nobody else is carrying the babies, to be
gender
honest.
equality, there is a difference.
Yeah. Well, one of the
So
things, what I was
yeah,
going to
no,
say
for
was
sure.
one thing I wish that there were is a way for us for people who are curious and kind of maybe the overproduced elite or what have you, but people to be able to be involved in a scientific pursuit or an endeavor. Could I get involved somehow in helping with a research project? I know how to do
Yeah,
research. I've written publications. Like,
sure.
would you see that in the future that there's any way for this huge abundance of overproduced elites?
Yeah.
Maybe they're not that elite anyways, but they have this huge amount of super specialized expertise that just is gone. Like it's evaporated. What shouldn't we be like doing something with that?
Well,
I
probably,
mean,
yeah. The answer is yes. The trouble is the system, there aren't mechanisms. We haven't developed mechanisms. I thought with women we would. And there have been, I mean, I know many cases where there's been this sort of halfway house, women of developing families, doing research or teaching and so forth. But it's very tough. The trouble is you don't get rewarded for it. I mean,
right.
the other thing is, if anything, institutions take advantage of it
Yes.
rather than seeing it as supportive and solving a social problem or whatever. They pay very poorly. It's the same, it's very similar to using adjunct professorships and so on,
Hmm.
people teaching courses for pittance relative to the sort of permanent staff. Women in that situation tend to be treated very poorly. We
Hmm.
still have not adjusted. I think Europe does a much better job, is my impression, allowing many months, 6 months off of pregnancy leave, including the husband, which doesn't
Right.
happen. I mean, here it's sort of hopeless. You're lucky to get a few weeks if you're lucky.
Right. You're rewarded for work up front, I guess, right? Like
Yeah,
tenure supposedly is supposed to be after you've proved yourself.
yeah,
But the problem is like women have to be proving themselves during their reproductive years. That's a
yeah,
little bit of an issue.
absolutely.
You know?
No, it's
Um,
a hell of a problem. I know I've been close to several women that have had to go through this, and some choose not to have children, of course,
mhm.
because of this.
That's
Well,
that's bad. We need smart women having
I
children.
mean, but it's a big issue which society and more generally, but in particular academia, has simply not come properly to terms with at all.
Right.
I'm not up with the way various universities have tried to deal with it. I don't know
Yeah.
any that have done very well with it, frankly.
No. I mean, I think you can't legislate these values. You
Yeah,
can't enforce these values where they're not appreciated, where the I guess the market forces don't value this.
no, not at all.
So,
Not
I
at
mean,
all.
yeah, these are things that we'll have to come to terms with that I don't know why I'm asking you, but I
Yeah,
just
I don't know. No, not a very good person to, I'm very empathetic and sympathetic, and I certainly in individual
right.
cases, I've tried very hard to, facilitate a situation that people can still be, you know, intellectually
Yeah.
active and raise a family.
Yeah, I don't see the solution for that. There are some things that I see solutions emerging, but that one is one that I think will be
Yeah.
shrouded for a while. But one of the things that occurred, I guess maybe there'll be a last subject we touch on. One of the things that occurred at the intelligence symposium we were at was I noted how many times like the word collective stupidity was used and then
Yes, I
misinformation.
have to admit, I used it.
Yeah, you were funny. I enjoyed your talk. Like I said, you brought this kind of comfort to the discussion. This like you changed the discussion in a way that felt like, okay, we can be real about things. It felt very snobbish. It felt like I didn't like it. And so yesterday I was actually at the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Misinformation,
Hmm.
and they brought in Michael Strevens. I don't know if you're familiar with
I know the
his
name. I
work.
don't know him. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he was talking about, I'm watching this and I'm cracking up because he's basically telling this committee, science is kind of chaotic. I can't tell you what's misinformation and what's not. It's all bullshit until it's not. And then it's probably still bullshit. And these people's faces they were just like,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
They were so upset. And I think there's this general, maybe people are waking up to it, but there's this general problem about the word misinformation that, like, we got to smash it. We have to stomp it out. We have to snuff it. And it's like, well, what the fuck is it? So what is your general thought about this? Because I don't think you really like addressed this there at all.
Yeah, I don't know. Yes, I mean, there's a difference, I think, between what I was thinking of as collective stupidity versus misinformation. I mean, they're obviously interrelated,
Mm-hmm.
but misinformation, of course, is now becoming, it's certainly become much more prevalent. Whatever it means, we'll talk about what it means in a minute. Than it was 10 years ago. I mean, I'm not even sure the word sort of existed 10 years ago. I mean, certainly people talked about being misinformed, but it had a benign, the word to be misinformed sort of had a certain benign thing. It's like being that you looked up, the time of a plane, and it turns out, either you misread it or you asked someone and they said something and it was wrong. Well, sort of, you were misinformed or whatever. Or what was it, the famous scene in Casablanca where whatever it was, the German Gestapo Nazi says to Bogart, why are you in Casablanca? And he said, I came to be near the waters. And he says, but we're not near the waters. And Bogart says, I guess I was misinformed. So that's sort of, that's sort of my image of misinformed and
Yeah.
therefore by extrapolation misinformation. Now it's taken on a whole different thing and
Mm-hmm.
arising, I suppose, primarily because of the Trump phenomenon, and that just sort of apparently making things up and telling things that were, for want of a better word, just lies, basically, with consequence. And I think that's the thing that's important, is that those have powerful consequences. And now, of course, with AI and ChatGPT and all the rest of it, it's become much more threatening because, especially with the whole internet and social
Sure. It's
media,
ominous.
inevitably, because it's hard to tell. So in that sense, that's a whole different question, of which I do not have expertise for sure. So, but that, although I have strong opinions, that, I don't know how you solve it.
You got to get your Nobel first, and
No,
then you
right.
can talk
Oh,
about
that's right.
this.
That's right. Then people will listen to me. But, that it's hard to combat.
Hmm.
It's now becoming extremely difficult to combat misinformation. If a newspaper in the past, when newspapers were a dominant medium, and that's what people learnt their news about, or Walter Cronkite on the evening news, and he said
The one
something
source.
wrong, they would,
Mm-hmm.
you learnt about it extremely quickly, and they would apologize.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that simply doesn't exist. I mean, first of all, those media are now subdominant. But in the media that we have, where we learn most of our news, you don't even bother to. They don't. There's not even. If there is any apology, it's down in the fine print. I mean, metaphorically
Right.
speaking, you never hear it. No one cares, and in any case, because going back to what I said, the pace of life is so accelerated,
Yeah.
no one pays attention. No one cares anyway.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of remarkable that, in a certain sense, very few people care that Trump was lying the way he does and continues to do so.
Yeah.
There seems to be no penalty any
Well,
longer.
I think people expect that politicians were lying, and arguably, the first case we really,
Yes,
Watergate, right? But then we saw this with Clinton.
yes,
We've seen a couple of these things where we're just like,
absolutely.
weapons of mass destruction. So I think we're just now immune to
No, I
we're
think you're
so
right. We're
immune to lies.
immune, and
Yeah.
secondly, because of social media and because of the power of the internet, we can check on things much faster
Yeah.
and disseminate that much faster. And then it just becomes, so what we considered fact, true or false, now becomes a matter of opinion. You know, I mean, it's,
Well, it's not so easy. Like, I mean, at the committee yesterday, they were saying, we didn't think it would be this hard to fact check hard sciences. I'm a social scientist, she was
yeah,
saying from Cornell. But she's like, I didn't realize, like, the studies about masks, we really didn't know what the hell we were talking
yeah,
about.
yeah,
So there, but again, it's like this reliance upon the certainty of science
yes.
that we don't have that. What, and who's going to tell people that?
Yeah, so that's another thing that, of course, has come up, which has been a shock to many of us, is that okay, so it's easy to talk about politics and the corporate world and all that, and sort of be high and mighty about it, but in fact, to discover that in academia, people are being corrupt and cheating. I mean, it's actually a fairly small minority. Nevertheless, we had this image that we were sort of pure, that no
Mm-hmm.
one, and if they did, it was like that being the old version of misinformed that I talk about. Oh, it was sort of an accidental
Oops.
mistake. And I
Yeah.
remember one of the first major ones 15, 20 years ago was with David Baltimore. I'm talking about? He was Nobel Prize winner, president of Caltech at the time, but he
Mm.
worked at Rockefeller University. Was a very, very distinguished sort of biomedical guy, and a piece of work that I think was in Nature that he was in his group. A postdoc was the lead author, and they discovered, I have the details wrong, but that she made up a large part of the data, and it was all wrong.
Oof.
And that was astonishing. And Baltimore, of course, immediately denied knowing anything about it. And of course, I felt that was reasons to condemn him, frankly. I mean,
Right. You should know what's
I
going
mean,
on
he
in your
should bloody
lab.
well know. I mean, did he, okay. I mean, okay, it's a borderline case. I mean, it is hard sometimes. I mean, I trust,
Sure.
when my postdocs or collaborators, do a certain analysis and they say that's what it is, or they say, this was the data, and so we don't do experiments, but just analyzing
Right.
it, I have to believe them, and it's true, and I
Right.
can't, no longer. In fact, I mean, in principle, I could check them, but I would have to do what you said earlier. I would have to go back and take a whole course in statistics and data
Yeah.
analysis because mine is so out of date, to do that. So, it's in a certain sense understandable, but it's terrible. But that was one of the first that I was, that I think shook the
Yeah.
community, and he was exonerated eventually.
Hmm.
Um, but now we see many cases that
Okay.
high-profile journals that papers have to be retracted or someone has to apologize or defend themselves and so on.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions, of course, that's begging about all of that, was this always like this?
Mm.
Maybe, it's just because we didn't have the spotlight on it. We didn't have the kind of social media and the means to
Hmm.
really go back and look at things in the way we can now, that, we just assumed everybody was honest and forthright, and they didn't sort of, only showed you the data that was good and the stuff that was
Cherry
bad, they
pick.
chucked
Yeah.
in the wastepaper basket. Do we know that? We do know there have been cases in the past, but they're unique. That was the thinking. These were so
Hmm.
unique, but maybe it was as much as it always was, or, which I
Right.
suspect there was more than we ever thought, but I think it's much more now. And that goes
Hmm.
again to the whole thing we talked about earlier, the extraordinary pressures on people.
Pace. Yeah. Well, and
So
the
it's very tempting.
pace of research.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's very tempting. I mean, you're doing something, you're working on something. This is obviously right. It's good. We're doing this experiment, or we have this data. Well, it doesn't quite support it, but that's because we don't have quite enough data. But let's just shoehorn it in. I can easily extrapolate to see how people
Sure.
get carried.
I've been
I've got
there.
to get the grant. We got to get the bloody proposal finished and in. We got to get, all these things build up. And we are human beings.
Yes.
We're full of our foibles. So, but how you control this and how we monitor it is totally unclear. And I don't think the academic community has at all come to terms with that.
No. Well, you took this in a disinformation direction.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No,
You're
no,
rather
it
misinformed. I
works.
did indeed.
No, it works though, because I was just writing about this, and I think a lot of it has to do with our incentive structures. Like
Yes.
whether or not it's the rate of this has accelerated or not, it's coming to our attention as a problem, and we have to address potentially some of the incentive mechanisms that are causing this to occur.
Yeah.
And I think we also have to decide what's the price. What is the price of these things being falsified, and
Absolutely.
how much does it cost us?
There's a very interesting price that does really concern me, and that is the propensity when, in society in general, when people transgress, we introduce new rules and new policing and new constraints and
Yes,
oversight, and then you
yes,
box everything in.
yes,
And what does that mean in academia? It means even less curiosity, even less
right.
speculation, less willingness to put your neck out and say something or do something, even though
Hmm.
that's not directly related to mis or disinformation.
Right,
But it's that the system sort of had this sort of Soviet style image of control.
right, right.
And so that would be a terrible price to pay. But I'm fearful that that is the price we're going to end up paying.
Yeah, I think what's happening is we've got these watchdog organizations that are coming and finding these things. And I'm like, that's really cool that we have people who are
Yeah,
looking at Western blots and going, did they copy and paste this shit? I
right.
think that should be rewarded. That's really cool
Yeah.
because it sets up an intrinsic kind of monitoring to say, if you falsify this, we gonna catch you. But I also think that this is being used as ammunition from I don't want to name any political groups, but to say that academia is full of shit.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem. So I think we need to address misinformation on all sides of the aisle. And I think it has to do with us not utilizing all the information we have available and all the people who want to think about it.
Hmm.
And somehow there's roles here for each of these groups. And I think it's going to take a while to shake out, but I agree. I worry that more regulation on this is going to decrease innovation.
Yeah, that's the price you often pay.
Yeah.
I mean, so I am concerned, even though I recognize that it's a really challenging problem and it's a terrible issue that's turned up.
I think one of the things, this will be the final thing we talk about, I'll let you hop off, but one of the things I noticed and one of the things I worry about in complexity is that it feels a little bit obfuscatory. Like there's some like obscurantism possible in there. It's one of the weaknesses I think I've picked up on in certain areas. Can you say anything about that?
Well, yes, it can, because it's the very nature of what it is. It's dealing with the sort of the big messy world out there, and it covers sort of the entire territory of socioeconomic and biological, biomedical problems. And also, there's this other piece to it, part of its beginnings with chaos and dynamical systems and so on. So you put all that together, it's inevitably going to produce sometimes all kinds of obscure manifestations that also make it sound much more sophisticated and complicated than it actually is. And that's always an
Yeah.
issue. But I would say it's not much more than occurs in most other fields. So if I think of the fields that, first of all, I'm familiar with, which is high energy physics, in particular string theory and general relativity, origins of the universe, my God, the obscurantism that often gets
Yeah.
expressed, because that attracts a whole different kind of audience, a sort
Right.
of more science fiction-y sort of
Right.
way out their audience, especially about multiverses and multiple dimensions and so on. So that gets all kind of, airy-fairy. So the complexity I think, is less obscure than some of that stuff. But then there's another kind of obscurantism that all you have to do is pick up a copy of Science or Nature, the two supposedly most prestigious journals, especially in the biomedical and genetic sciences. Talk about obscure, and talk about, things that are dealing with one diddly problem that, and it's so obscure with an obscure notation because you have to know it.
That's, I think, more esoteric. It's like
Esoteric.
very
Maybe that's a better
so
word.
niche.
You're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah.
It's much more esoteric. Yes, you're absolutely
hmm
right. It's Talmudic, and
Yeah.
it's like you're reading. If you try to read the mystical Kabbalistic literature or something, you know, and it's kind of extraordinary because of what Science and Nature claim that they want to publish. That's the way. That's the context I'm giving it,
Mm.
because they always tell you they want things that are for the general audience and for the general. It's quite the contrary. And of course, I'm going off a complete tangent, and that's because they're beholden unto the pharmaceutical and medical industry. Well,
Yeah.
it's slightly disgraceful if you actually think about misinformation, disinformation, and corruption. The two most prestigious scientific journals have advertisements in them.
Ah.
They rely on advertising income. And that is
Hmm.
absolute. Talk about mightier than thou in terms of their opinion pieces. Nature is a special case. It's unique because it's a private journal.
hmm
Science is truly disgraceful because it's a publication of the AAAS.
Yeah.
I mean, my God, if the journals I'm familiar with, Physical Review or for physics and so on,
Yeah.
I mean, the idea that there'd be advertising in it would be, was horrifying.
Yeah.
I'm really going way out there. I consider that corrupt.
Interesting. I think, well, the market forces, I think, of the giant machine that science has become the business.
Yeah,
That's just, I think, another big, huge cog that keeps the wheels
yeah,
turning
of
in
course,
in perverse ways.
of course. Yeah, so
Yeah.
there's many other things I could focus on I know corrupt is a very strong word to use in this context,
Maybe perverse,
but
I
it
think, is
does,
the,
it gives
yeah.
you pause. We shouldn't take it for granted, which is what we do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we should ask, what are the consequences of the fact that nature and science are to some extent supported by the pharmaceutical and biomedical industries?
Yeah. Well, I mean, all these everything is interconnected because all these journals, Elsevier, it
Yeah,
requires the constant growth that a capitalistic market
sure.
requires, and so it's just part and parcel for all of this. And this conversation has gone in so many
Yeah,
different
so
directions. I know, I love it. This is my favorite. And I think this is why I enjoy, the complexity stuff. Maybe I'm a little galaxy brained on it, but I I enjoy this because there are aspects of interrelation. There are threads throughout all of this. And so I really appreciated you going with me on that
Sure.
ride
Yeah,
today.
no, I was quite happy to let you determine the direction of the conversation. It was sort of
Yeah,
interesting. These are things I don't normally talk a great deal about. But
good.
no, I thought, of course, originally it would be more on, in my narcissistic way, on my own work and the kinds of things I do and all my great
Yeah,
accomplishments or whatever,
yeah,
or even on the collective intelligence symposium from a couple of weeks ago and all the questions. So it's kind of interesting that it went in a quite different direction and all these
yeah.
sort of um, problems that are the ecology, if you like, of
hmm
ecology and science and so on in its broader context.
Yeah, that's kind of what I try to do here with neo academia. I'm not exactly sure what it is yet, but to me, it's a constellation of all the things that are happening
Yeah,
to human knowledge and
yeah,
how, I mean, even having a podcast is somehow kind of involved in there, ancillary in some communication
yeah,
aspect. But that's kind of where I go with these things. So I try to bring threads that maybe you wouldn't have talked about already, but you still have quite a bit of
Yeah.
knowledge
No,
and
that's true.
interest in.
I give, I've been on many podcasts and interviews and so on, and I would say most of the things we talked about did not turn up. It was much less about the actual science than it is about, as I say, the context of science.
Right, the system itself. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thanks for making time for
But
me. I'm
great.
so
No, it's a
glad we
pleasure.
finally got to connect.
Pleasure,
Yeah.
Natasha.
Thank you for listening, and I'm so glad you stayed for the Big Nerve Challenge question, which is, what could be an interesting solution to one of the problems in science that I discussed with Geoffrey? That could be defining and evaluating misinformation, catching the intellectual overflow, fixing a culture of hubris, fear, and narcissism, or managing scientific fraud. Check the newsletter for a link to the Big Nerve question, and if you like, check the timestamps for links to each of these topics.